Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Eye on Education. I'm Susan Mills, Vice Chair of the NCGOP, and with me today I have Dr. Terry Stoops, who is our Director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation.
Yes.
So wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us
Well,
today.
thank you for having me.
Absolutely. With our Eye on Education, we really want to have some great conversations with others that are in education, and we want to be able to push this out to other conservatives across our state and to help our voters understand what is going on in education and things they need to be aware of and look for whenever they're selecting who they would like to vote for. So, and you're certainly one of those that's in the know. So just to get us started here a little bit, education is just a huge topic in North Carolina. And how have you seen it change in the last few years?
Well, the pandemic really has changed everything when we think about what education looks like now as compared to 5 years ago. And it changed it in predictable and unpredictable ways. The predictable way that it changed, that the entire response to COVID changed education, was after the lockdowns, after the masking, after all the measures that were imposed on our students, they're not performing anywhere near where they were in 2019. The academic fallout is absolutely staggering when we look at how our students were performing before versus after the pandemic. And this is entirely predictable. During the pandemic, the John Locke Foundation, conservatives, Republicans, and even some in the middle and the left were talking about the lasting damage that these lockdowns would have on our children. And it was entirely predictable that when we got the first batch of test scores, when we got the second batch of test scores, we could see the lasting damage that the pandemic had on our children. And if you look at North Carolina Department of Public Instruction analysis, you see that it affected all students. Mm-hmm. There was this idea that, our high-performing students are going to be just fine. No. Students that are academically and intellectually gifted were suffered through the pandemic just like our lowest performers. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is while the gaps have widened, the achievement gaps between traditionally low-performing populations and high-performing populations, there are some groups that are recovering much faster than others. The unpredictable way that the pandemic changed education in North Carolina and everywhere really was that there were parents that were really comfortable. And these were parents that were in the suburbs. They had bought a house that was close to a school that they wanted their children to attend because they believed that that school was going to be the school that best met the needs of their children. And they had the resources that made it possible for them to be able to move to an area, a subdivision that would give their child that type of school that they believed was going to allow their children to excel. The reality is that parents started to get to see, while the lockdowns happened, what was going on in those classes. We had online classes that students were taking and parents peeking over shoulders. They were listening in on the conversation. And a lot of parents didn't like what they heard. And what they realized was those schools were not as good as they thought. And suddenly they started thinking about the necessity of having educational options. Suburban, middle, and upper middle class parents during the pandemic came to a realization. And this, what they were seeing happen in their child's education, the decisions that were made by the school board, by the State Board of Education, by state and federal officials, by Governor Cooper, convinced them that not only were they wrong in thinking that they could buy their way into a good school, but that educational opportunities for all children, not just low-income or special needs children, is absolutely essential for a public education system.
Could not agree more with that. And for those of you, if you're not aware, I am a high school teacher, and I teach in a public, in a public high school. So I I see the things that you've just talked about on a daily basis, the difference with our children. I've also seen those that have not come back, that whether they've gone on to a charter school or a private school, or they've just disappeared. So we have had some of those. But one of the things that this interview, or the interviews that we've been doing, is to really empower our school board candidates and to give them information they may not be aware of, and to try to help them, because I truly believe that for our education and to make a big difference in education is to elect conservative Republicans. So can you tell me how much power parents and local leaders really have through the school board versus maybe using the state or federal policies?
It really depends on the area, but my general answer to that is always they have much more than they believe that they do. There is this belief that the federal government, the state government, impose mandates that make it impossible for school board members to be able to breathe, essentially, and come up with policies that are really well suited to their local communities. Now, in some cases, that's absolutely the fact. If you accept, for example, school lunch money from the federal school lunch program, there are requirements that you have to follow to the letter. So in that way, there's not much a local school district can do if they're participating in the federal school lunch program to make changes to their lunch program.
Right.
But there are some areas where there are flexibility for local leaders. A lot of local leaders don't realize that they have some flexibility in the curriculum that's chosen for our schools. This is a very important point, but it goes to the idea that the state, because it writes the largest check, wants to control every aspect of public education. And while they do make some rules that every school board and every local official has to follow, the truth is that there's a great deal of flexibility to adopt a curriculum so long as it's aligned with state standards. So state standards are just very general guidelines of what teachers need to cover during a year. If you're a history teacher, it's the era and some topics that you need to cover just to make sure that there is a sufficient amount of coverage for that subject during the school year. But that doesn't mean that there is a state-mandated curriculum. The day-to-day activities are very much a local and a school issue. We so often rely on teachers to come up with curricula on their own. A lot of them go onto the internet, unfortunately, to find some curriculum, which isn't always a good idea. But school districts have a great deal of autonomy in that area. And there's a second very important place where they have a tremendous amount of autonomy, and that's in their local funding. Around 25% of education revenue is coming from their county commissioner. And the county commission, most county commissions, have very few parameters on how local school districts can spend that money. There are no state or federal guidelines that dictate how school districts spend that money. They use it in all kinds of different ways. Some use it for salary supplements. Some use it to fund consultants and central office personnel, unfortunately. But there is so much flexibility in the use of that 25% or so funding that it is an opportunity for districts to do creative things. Unfortunately, so many school board members have this mindset that there are restrictions in place that don't allow them to take their knowledge from the private sector or nonprofit sector and apply it to their school district. And I think just with a little creativity and understanding the amount of flexibility that they actually have would give school board members a tremendous opportunity to be able to do some very unique things that I think would absolutely benefit children. The nature of politics, unfortunately, means that a lot of members of school boards are going to be pointing their finger and to the state or the federal government saying, well, it's their fault, it's their fault. But in some cases, it certainly is. But in most cases, the school board really needs to just take control of what they have control of and find ways to operate within the parameters that really do allow them to do creative and innovative things.
Kind of playing off of that, I'm going to ask this question because I know this is one of the things that a lot of schools are having to do are surveys.
Yes.
And some of them are using Panorama. So can our school board, local board members, could they take control of that and keep Panorama out? Is that something that is possible with them?
Well, that really depends. If they have taken grant money that requires them to use Panorama, it kind of puts them in a difficult position. And this goes to something that I think is difficult for a lot of school members, school board members, and elected officials to grasp, is that if there's an opportunity for money, they don't need to take it if the strings attached make it too difficult to operate, or if there are objectionable parts of the grant that make it difficult for the school district to do what's in the best interest of the children and the families. I always point to an example that charter schools don't need to take federal nutrition money, for example. And many don't because of the restrictions and the tremendous cost that's imposed on charter schools that take the federal nutrition money. And those types of flexibilities in smaller ways, state-level grants, local grants, are extended to school boards. Just because someone is offering you money doesn't mean it's a good idea to take it. Our charter schools understand that very well. They understand that sometimes the strings that are attached tend to be wrapped around you and make it such that you really can't move. And the federal government is, of course, the classic political entity in creating strings that make it impossible for any sort of public institution to breathe. We had a reprieve during the Trump administration where he was cutting strings left and right. Now they're coming back, and they're going to be worse than ever because the federal government has committed so much money, especially after the pandemic, to our public schools that there's going to be certainly consequences for any school district that doesn't play along with the federal mandates that we're starting to see come out of the Biden administration.
So they're going to actually lose money if they don't play along, is what I understand. Is that?
They certainly could. This would require the federal government or some sort of entity to actually pursue action against the school district or some public official. Perhaps it's a situation where you don't ask permission. You just go ahead and do it and use the money in the best interest of children. It's why we have school boards in the first place. It's an important point to mention is that we have school boards because they understand the needs of local communities. And the closer you can get to the local communities, the closer you will be to being able to make decisions that correspond to the local community's needs. The reason why the federal government fails so often is because they're nowhere near our local communities. And I think most people like the fact that they're nowhere near the local communities, but the idea that they think that they can impose things on local communities that they know better is truly a mistake.
Playing off of that then, how important is it that parents have rights when it comes to their child's education? And how can parents make sure their children are being educated and not indoctrinated?
Yeah, this is truly, truly difficult. First of all, parent rights are everything. Parents need to be involved in their child's education because it's instrumental to their success. Research shows again and again that involved, engaged parents produce children that achieve at higher levels than those that don't. And it's logic. It's not anything that we necessarily need research to tell us, but we know that an engaged parent that is working and collaborating with teachers and administrators is going to have tremendous success for their children. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And so, there are situations and exceptions. But regardless of that, the ability for parents to be able to assess what's going on in the classroom is very difficult because there is no central repository for curriculum. It's not as if parents could say, I'm going to see what my child is doing on Tuesday, next Thursday, next month, next year. We don't have anything like that. The John Locke Foundation has been very supportive of curriculum transparency efforts that would give parents at least a general sense of what's going on in the classroom. But with so many schools leaving curriculum up to teachers, not only do different schools sometimes have different curricula, but different classrooms within the same school have different curricula. And when you think about that tremendous variation, it can be really frustrating for parents who are earnestly trying to help their child by understanding what's going on in the classroom. So I really think that the key is curriculum and academic transparency. It doesn't have to be anything that imposes an extraordinary burden on teachers. In fact, it shouldn't be something that imposes an extraordinary burden. But so many teachers are already expected to turn in unit plans and lesson plans to their administrators. A natural extension of that would be to provide some sort of limited access to those materials to parents that are interested in collaborating with teachers to know what's going on in the classroom and then to take that knowledge and help their child at home. This is an idea that academic transparency is somehow trying to snoop into the affairs of teachers, when in reality, it's the ultimate tool for parents to become collaborators in their child's education. And I think that has very powerful potential. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of resistance to that idea, but I think that in upcoming legislative sessions, it will be revived. And I think there's a lot of promise if we consider it as a way to collaborate rather than as a way to snoop.